Hello everyone, welcome back to the journey of my YouTube channel, and welcome to the first sequels versus originals video that I have done in a while. I wanted to do this one because this year I started the Earthsea Cycle. My friend Annika Crum sent me this as part of a book exchange that we did with the author conservatory where we're both students. She's really cool. She's a writer too. She has a fantasy map making business, so I will link to her stuff in the description so you can check her out. She got me started on Earthsea, and I really enjoyed the first book, so then I got this. It's so huge and heavy, and it's the whole Earthsea series. It's all 6 books, and then like a bunch of short stories and stuff too, and maps and illustrations and all the cool stuff. So you can tell that I liked book 1 because I decided to invest in this. And I've also read book 2 so far, which I got from the library on its own, but I gave that back to the library, so now I just have this. So when I'm talking about book 2, I will hold up this, even though it includes much more than book 2, and that way we can talk about book 2, which is called The Tombs of Atuan, and I can also get an arm workout. So of course, now that I've read a couple books in this series, we need to talk about which one is better, the first book or the second book, because I tend to have a thing for sequels. I really like well-executed sequels. I made a whole introductory video to this series about this, so I'll link to that in case you want to check out my thing about sequels, but this was definitely a sequel that I did want to talk about, and just a series that I want to start talking about on my channel, because so far I'm a big fan of the series. I've started book 3 now, and that's going well so far, so there may be more Earthsea content on my channel, who knows. So book 1, I guess I'll read the back cover blurb just to kind of summarize what it's about. Ged was the greatest sorcerer in all Earthsea, but he was once called Sparrowhawk, a reckless youth hungry for power and knowledge, who tampered with long-held secrets and loosed a terrible shadow upon the world. This is the tale of his testing, how he mastered the mighty words of power, tamed an ancient dragon, and crossed death's threshold to restore the balance. With millions of copies sold worldwide, that's not the blurb anymore. That's just talking about how it sold a lot of copies of books. But anyway, so let's start with the pros for book 1, A Wizard of Earthsea. The writing style is the first thing that comes to mind. There aren't that many books where I feel like my favorite thing about it is the prose and the writing style, but that might be the case with this. It's just so incredibly well written. I mentioned these books in my book 2 birthday video, and I said that I needed to make a whole video about them, so that's another reason for making this video, and basically just kind of what I kept stammering in that video is like, it's really well written, and I don't say that lightly. Just like the word crafting is absolutely incredible, which makes a lot of sense because the whole magic system of these worlds is about names. It's about the power of words. So the fact that words are incredibly well used in every sentence of these books is very fitting. And I especially really love how this author highlights things like nature and weather and how each different island in the archipelago feels. It's just so immersive, and it's such an experience to read, and that is just really the kind of book that I love to spend time in, the kind of book that makes me not just feel like I have to get to the end to find out what happens, but the kind of book that makes me feel like I don't want it to be the end yet, I just want to stay here. And there's also a really fascinating and well executed character arc, and what's interesting is that at the beginning Ged is really not very likable at all. He's like the back cover blurb said, he's rash, he's very proud, and he's very foolish, and the book completely calls him out on that. Like, that is how he's supposed to come across at the beginning. And not every author can do that in a way that still makes the book enjoyable to read. Sometimes a character just feels annoying, and it's like, I don't care about this story anymore. But I definitely did care about this story. I could tell that Ged was going to change, and spoilers, he does. I don't think that is a spoiler because, again, the book basically tells you that Ged is going to change. But then I just really liked how his journey was done, because he changes so much, and every step in that just felt really significant and really hit home, and it was just a really cool journey to get to take along with him as he went on this journey of becoming more humble and more wise. And kind of along the same lines, again, the themes are really deep, and then they're symbolized really well through the plot and through the imagery and through the magic system, and it all just ties really well together to point back again and again to these themes. And the author even talks about in the afterword how this is a little bit different from a lot of fantasy stories because it's not focused on big battles, it's not focused on people fighting against each other, it's not about the good guys versus the bad guys, it's really about Ged versus himself. The primary conflict is internal. The primary conflict is about him having to wrestle with the darkness that's inside himself. So that really makes the themes feel more mature and introspective than your typical Tolkien ripoff fantasy book. As for cons in book one, I don't really think this is a downside, but the main thing that might make people not be very excited about this book is that it does have a lot of fantasy tropes, where there's an orphan who discovers that he has magic and he has to leave his tiny home village to travel with a wiser mage who is going to train him to become the greatest wizard ever, and he has to defeat a great darkness unleashed upon the world. But first he has to go to a magic school where he makes friends and he also makes some enemies. And so it sounds kind of like your typical fantasy book. But when this was written in the 1960s, those tropes were not nearly as much of a thing as they are now. And I think a lot of people who have since written books with those tropes were probably building off of Earthsea, rather than Earthsea building off of tropes that were already there. It's definitely building off of some Lord of the Rings ideas, and it is also definitely the predecessor of Harry Potter in a lot of ways. I definitely like to tell people that this book is pretty much Lord of the Rings meets Harry Potter, which I know that's like the worst comparison you can make for a book, because everybody's like, there's no way it's gonna live up to being like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. But A Wizard of Earthsea basically is the Lord of the Rings meets Harry Potter in every possible way. So that's really the only con or downside that I could think of for this book, is that it might just feel pretty similar to some things that you've read before. But I think those tropes are executed really well, and it felt original and fresh to me, and I like those tropes, so it wasn't really a problem for me. So then we have book 2, The Tombs of Atuan, which I don't have a back cover blurb for this one, but it's about a girl named Tenar who gets taken to this temple in the Kargad Empire, and she's going to be made the new high priestess of this place with the tombs, and it's this like really creepy kind of cultish worship that she gets drawn into as a 5-year-old kid, and she's raised her entire life to be the next high priestess and all this stuff. And she's the only one who can go down into these underground tombs, and there's a big labyrinth down there and tons of treasure, and she's the only one allowed to go down there into the dark. But then somebody, kind of spoilers, it's Ged, shows up, and he's trying to retrieve a really important magical artifact that is hidden down in these treasure chambers in the tombs, and she has to make decisions about whether she's going to help him and break all the rules of being a high priestess and break out of the only life that she's ever known, or if she's going to essentially become like the people who went before her, if she's going to be trapped down in that darkness forever. So it's very different. One of the pros of book 2, I think, is just that the tone is very different from book 1. It doesn't feel at all like the kind of sequel that's just trying to copy book 1. It is just a completely different story in pretty much every way. It's about a girl versus a boy. It's about the Kargad Empire versus the archipelago, which is a totally different setting. It's in one location rather than traveling all over the world. It's underground instead of out on the open sea. So like it is just extremely different, and yet it feels very connected to the world of book 1. And it still very much feels like it belongs in this series, especially once Ged does show up. And then it's really cool how his character and this new character of Tenar combine, and how they interact and influence each other's character arcs. So it's really cool that it is connected to the rest of the series, but it's also very different at the same time. And it's much less tropey, I would say. There's still some fantasy tropes going on, but it's not quite the same orphan boy discovers he has powers, trains under wizard, goes to magic school kind of story. And even though I tend to really like those big classic quest plot types of fantasy, I absolutely loved this story, even though it was much smaller and more compact. And I actually felt like in some ways that showed off this author's writing even more. The writing, I will say it again, the prose and the wordcraft is just incredible. Like every single word just hit home, just hit the nail on the head. And I felt like the more cramped or small scale storytelling. It just really brought out how focused and dense and intense all the word choices were. And so I totally felt like I was there. It was very just mesmerizing and immersive. And I thought it was kind of cool how Tenar's character arc is similar to Ged's, in that she starts out being very young and very proud and very foolish, and then she grows into being a lot more humble and wise. But if Ged's story is all about defeating the darkness inside himself, Tenar's story is all about escaping the darkness inside herself, and especially wrestling with the fact that she is actually terrified of the dark, but she also has this desire to stay in the darkness. And that's part of what made her internal conflict so compelling for me, was that she genuinely wanted to stay in this situation, even though she kind of knew it was terrible. She genuinely wanted to stay in this life that she knew, but she was also terrified of it. She wanted to get out, but she wasn't sure if she could or if she should or if she even wanted to. So that was just very interesting. Again, it's a much more internal and introspective story than you might expect from fantasy, and that just made it really, really interesting for me, especially since the entire external story is like the perfect symbol and embodiment of what is going on inside Tenar. And again, this kind of goes against what I typically like in a fantasy story, but in some ways it's kind of a slow story. It's a very short story, so it doesn't feel like it takes forever to get from one thing to the next. But it's less action packed than the other one. There aren't really any battles or big fights. It's not like a swashbuckling adventure story or anything, but so much of it happens underground in a place that you might not be able to escape at any given time, with these old powers of the earth like constantly watching you and just waiting for you to mess up so they can squash you like a fly or bury you forever underground. And it is very freaky. It feels very high stakes. There is tons of tension even when there's not as much external conflict as some fantasy stories have. And then there's the ending, which is just so satisfying. I am very picky about endings, so when I find an ending that I really like, I am really excited about it. And I just felt like this ending did everything right, like absolutely everything right. I loved how it didn't end too soon after the climax, even though it's a very short book. It could have ended very abruptly after the climax, but it took the time to put in some realistic consequences and just a realistic aftermath and fallout for Tenar as a person. I felt like was done really well, and some fantasy books might have kind of skipped over that to make the ending feel more simple and happy. So I really appreciated that it ended with that note of kind of complexity. And it's kind of sad in some ways. There was one aspect of the ending where I was like, no, I don't want it to end like that. But I know it's better for the series as a whole. And personally, I like endings that are at least a little bit sad. I don't really like endings that are only happy. I want them to feel at least a little bit bittersweet. So I thought this ending was just so extremely strong. The ending of book one is also very strong, but this one stuck out to me even more just in how satisfying it was. So cons for book two. Kind of none. The plot is a little bit slow, like right before Ged shows up. It started to feel maybe a little bit repetitive, but that's also the point, that Tenar's existence is this very slow, repetitive monotony that is very hard to escape. So I didn't really have a problem with that. You might find it a little bit slow, but again, it's a short book, so it just does not take long to get to the good stuff. And there's one part where like Tenar goes and gets Ged and moves him to a different room, and then like she lets him out of the room, and then a few minutes later she's like, oh, let's take him back to that room that we just took him out of, or something. Like there was one really short passage over a couple pages, and I was like, I'm not sure what that was. Like that didn't really accomplish anything. But again, it was very short, and it didn't really matter. I was just trying to come up with something to talk about as a negative or a downside for this book, and like that was all I could find. Other than that, literally, I don't think there's anything about this story that I don't love. So time for the verdict. Which is better, the original or the sequel? I definitely know which one is heavier, and it's this one. And I might have already kind of given away my verdict a little bit by saying that I couldn't think of any downsides for the Tombs of Atuan, because I actually do think that the sequel is a little bit better than the original. Again, it just feels a little bit more unique. It just stood out to me a little bit more than A Wizard of Earthsea, but book one is also absolutely fantastic. So if you think that book one is better than book two, I don't blame you. I can see why that would be. Book 2 just really connected with me. So let me know if you've read both of these books, which one you think is better, and also let me know if there are any other sequels and originals that you think are interesting to compare. Maybe I should talk about them on my channel, or maybe you'd just like to tell me about them. So let me know what you think about that. I will see you guys next time. Thanks for journeying with me. Bye!